Welcome to the Wednesday, July 20th, 2022 Thurston County Planning Commission meeting. The Thurston County Planning Commission is a citizens advisory commission to the Board of County Commissioners on land use planning matters such as the comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance amendments. Planning Commission actions are in the form of recommendations to the county commissioners who are the final decision makers. All Planning Commission meetings are open to the public. Citizens are welcome to observe all Planning Commission briefings and work sessions. Public comment is allowed on those topics for which public hearings have not yet been held. My name is Eric Casino. I'm this season's chair of the Planning Commission. I represent District 2. We're going to do introductions in the room first and then online. So we'll start down here with Commissioner Simmons.
Jim Simmons, District 3.
Derek Day, District 1.
Helen Wheatley, District 1.
Barry Halverson, District 2.
Scott Nelson, District 3.
Online, Commissioner Carmen.
Doug Carmen, District 2.
Commissioner Pestinger.
Kevin Pestinger, District 1.
Commissioner Hanson.
Joel Hanson, District 3.
Great, thanks a lot. I'm glad everybody's machines are working. With that, I hope everybody has had a chance to look over the agenda. And with that, I did entertain a motion.
Move to approve the agenda.
The agenda has been approved and seconded. Any discussion?
I'd like a couple minutes at the very end, maybe under good of the order.
Sure. We can write
Just
that down.
one little item. I don't know where else to put.
No, that'd be fine. Yeah, I think we're gonna have a busy night, but we could probably squeeze something in here. All right, with that, we'll call for the vote.
Commissioner Day,
Aye.
Commissioner Halverson,
Aye.
Commissioner Hanson,
Aye.
Commissioner Carmen,
Aye.
Commissioner Nelson,
Aye.
Commissioner Pestinger,
Aye.
Commissioner Simmons,
Aye.
Commissioner Wheatley,
Aye.
Commissioner Casino.
Aye, and the agenda has been approved. With that, has everybody had a chance to look over the meeting minutes from July 6th? And if so, move approval. It's been moved.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on the meeting minutes from July 6th?
I have a couple of requested changes.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
In the section 5 for the emergency housing ordinance, in the third to last paragraph, I'm sorry, the second to last paragraph, it says, discussion ensued on safety and mental concerns, waivers, barriers to applying, incentives, public informational meetings, etc. I think we talked about additional safety options and trying to consider those. And whereas safety and mental concerns sounds like one thing and maybe slightly different, could we add the phrase discussion ensued on additional safety options and mental concerns as a separate, like comma separate?
I think that's a fairly reasonable request. Would there be any objections?
So that's request number 1.
Okay.
My second request is in section 7 under wireless code update. Third paragraph down, it says the commissioner is concerned that public comment was not incorporated into the setback language and decision making. I'm the one that made some of that comment, and I would restate that as a commissioner is concerned that public comment either was not incorporated into most of the language and decision making, or not included into most of the language and decision making, including setbacks, cumulative impacts and limits, public notifications, public comment and hearings, facility sizing differences, lack of regulations for small WCFs, and noise reduction.
So we can go back and re-listen to the minutes for that particular section, but we can't recreate or add words that were not said at that particular time.
Would it be okay if we tabled?
So the words that I said were most of the language.
Okay, we can have staff double check that, and we'll just table this motion until
Yeah.
that can be done and improve these at a later time.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Pestinger. Okay, with that, we're gonna move on. Did you have one more?
No, that was it. Thank you.
With that, we'll move on to the public communications portion of the meeting. We will be first taking public comment from within the boardroom, and I don't know if we have any public comment being requested from online, but first we'll hear from the board, and you would have 3 minutes. And first up on the list would be Loma Halverson. Oh, thank you. Then how about Sherry Buckner?
Thank you, Commission. I appreciate this. My name is Sherry Buckner, as you just said. I'm here on my own behalf, but I'm also on behalf of my community at large. It's been a great conversation with various different areas in the area where I live. I probably had communication with about 100 people. So 2 events occurred recently where I live, and I live just south of Tumwater. I've encouraged the city and the county to reassess and review their plans to create urban developments on high groundwater areas. I followed the most recent comprehensive plan review that was done last winter, and I asked the city and the county and staff to help me in encouraging the idea that high groundwater areas should be mapped and reassessed. And it is included in the implementation process of the comp plan that this should be done on occasion. My personal feeling that the areas should be mapped and that they should be left alone. The responses that I got over sort of a long length of time of following, I was very patient. I followed along with all the process. I read a lot of other documents besides just passively. And the response was that the current ordinances and policies are handling the problem. So I live next door to the Dolman/Tickner farm. It's a 300-acre farm. It's the edge of the Tumwater or UGA. It's kind of in the works. It's not really far along, but it's in the works to be expected to be developed. So it has wetlands and seasonal flooding on it. My own property right next door, just 3 acres, has about half through the winter fills up with pools, and I have a 30-foot diameter seasonal pond. This year, my neighbor, who doesn't really have a seasonal pond, but they use a sub pump on the house, and she also has 3 acres with just land around it, was pumping until June 15th. So, the obvious connection here is that we're worried. We're worried what's going to happen when you put a lot of houses on this land, which is complicated for sure, but risky. So Black Hills High School is on that same property. So after it was built, it flooded the neighboring 25 acres. It was a lawsuit followed. A former student at the school contacted me and stated that she was a student that fish came out of the ground and they were in the grass. And that was the first I'd even heard of that. They'd taken the fish to the science department and he identified as a fish that possibly came from the Chavis River system. It bothered me like, you don't know how much that bothers me. She describes the area as having a lake underground. About a month ago, a developer across the street from this area was planning to bring in soils, and the soil was from the Asarco landfill sites. I would hope that you have probably heard of it. It was contaminated with 300 acres, including arsenic. There was a small meeting of people who came. It was very difficult meeting. It was an upset meeting. But we asked them why. Why do you want to bring in tons? I don't know how many different truckloads of soil. Why do you have to do this? The answer was there's high groundwater on it and we want to infill and make it work for us because it's zoned to put 14 houses per acre, and that's pretty exciting to some people.
Ms. Buckner, I'd ask you to wrap it up. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm going to speed this up. And then we heard about the Hopkins ditch and the preserve, which I would expect all of you to know that this is leading to mitigation and lawsuits. It's very exact same kind of situation that I'm trying to express to you right now. So I wanted to say that underground water, high groundwater it's not controlled by one place. It's not controlled by a small piece of land. It's not controlled by an area. It's huge and it moves wherever it wants to go. And pretty much you don't know where your impacts are going to be until it's over with. I mean, really, honestly. I'm asking that the council take value in this situation and instead of piecemeal, and I think risky planning when it comes to high groundwater, suggest to the commission to take this more seriously. I believe in the future, the next things that you can expect this pattern. And I think you can see the pattern. I don't know why I have to even say it tonight. I really don't. But I think you're going to see lawsuits. I think you're going to be people with strife and difficulty that they don't even want between each other. So I'm just asking you to take this seriously. There's got to be another way, whether it's rezoning, whether it's a forum, maybe a mapping situation. People don't like regulations. It doesn't matter, but I'm asking you to help. I wouldn't come here. I'm a little desperate, so I'm really asking for help.
Thank you for your comments. Is there anybody else in the boardroom that'd like to address the planning commission? With that, is there anybody online? All right, seeing no hands, we will move on to the next section of our agenda, which is new business, which is on the docket item number 818, agricultural critical areas ordinance updates with Ashley.
Hi, I am so happy to be here with a new topic. Oh, I did miss you at the July 6th meeting. I'm just going to go ahead and share the screen. Justin. I don't want to miss the first pretty picture to set the stage for the discussion. So for the record, my name is Ashley Rye, and I'm a natural resources planner with the Community Planning Division. Tonight, we are going to talk about how new and expanded agricultural uses intersect with our critical areas protections. This is intended to be a collaborative discussion at a concept level, so please chime in with ideas and questions. Don't hesitate. To start us off, I'm just gonna provide a little bit of background. And if I miss anything, I hope Commissioner Nelson will fill in the gaps. So back in 2011, the state created the Voluntary Stewardship Program, which I tried to outline a little bit in the memo, and I'll go into some of those details in a little bit. This is an incentive-based program, and it was intended to balance, or is intended to balance, the protection and enhancement of critical areas on existing ag lands while promoting agricultural viability. The county very quickly enrolled all of the watershed basins into VSP in 2011. And then pending the completion of our own VSP work plan here in Thurston County, the critical areas regulations for agriculture were left untouched during our broader 2012 critical areas ordinance update. Subsequent to that, the VSP work plan was approved in 2017 and does apply to all existing and ongoing agricultural uses. And then in 2020, the board went ahead and docketed an item to update the critical areas regulations for new agricultural uses because those were never done. So now we're going to spend a little bit of time clarifying what constitutes existing and what constitutes new, because it's really important to this discussion. The state essentially breaks agricultural uses into two buckets, existing and new. So the voluntary stewardship program applies to existing and ongoing agricultural activities and facilities. And since Thurston County enrolled all its watershed basins in this program, any existing or ongoing agricultural activity or facility created before the creation of VSP, which is July 22nd, 2011, can participate. The way VSP works, it's a voluntary program. It is administered by the Thurston Conservation District, which I'll refer to as we move forward as TCD, if that's okay. They are our technical service provider. TCD works with farmers to prepare individual stewardship plans, which demonstrate how conservation practices can help protect and enhance any critical areas on site. This piece is particularly important. The monitoring and performance under VSP are done on a watershed basin level not a property specific or like site specific level. And 2011 is recognized as the benchmark rather than the time of application for any proposed projects. So I put a picture of my new horse on here as we're talking about new ag lands, and happy to answer any questions about that too. So the state doesn't allow new or expanded ag to be enrolled in VSP, but the Growth Management Act requires counties to adopt development regulations that do protect critical areas for these projects. And new or expanded could be an existing farm that wants to build a new building or put in a new drainage ditch or expand into land that wasn't farmed before. So if they have a forested portion of their property and they want to convert it into ag, that would be considered new, even though it's a long-standing farm that may have been around for a few generations. So the county has two sets of regulations that would apply to a new or expanded agricultural use. For new agricultural activities, this is sort of like the use of the land. So a forested area being converted to croplands, we would use chapter 1715. And that's that outdated one that's been around for a long time and wasn't touched when we did the 2012 Critical Areas Ordinance update. We also have Title 24, which you're familiar with, our Critical Areas Ordinance, and these provisions would apply to new agricultural buildings or facilities. And this would be like shelters for animals, drainage ditches, access roads, and things of that nature. In contrast to the VSP program, no net loss under the Growth Management Act must be measured at the site level rather than the basin level, and the benchmarks are established at the time of application. So all that said, our conversation tonight will be focused on new or expanded agricultural uses and how to apply critical areas protections. So we will be sharing results from our most recent 2021 ag survey and research into what other counties are doing. And then we'll open it up and review the concepts we're looking at as we move forward with drafting a package of code amendments. Before we go any further, any questions about newer ag? Because this one like blew my mind when I was just trying to figure it out and all the different regulations that apply. Are we all good?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I know this isn't about different types of agriculture, but just based on the timing of it, does this have a really outsized impact to, say, cannabis farming, especially where that might have replaced some other form of previous farming?
No, so that's actually a really good question, Commissioner Pessinger. Existing ongoing ag uses is like you can switch from one crop to another. So you could switch from growing apples to putting in a vineyard. So that wouldn't be affected unless you wanted to expand.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, moving on to survey results. So you might be familiar with the community-driven review of agriculture policies and programs. It's another one of the docketed items for comp plan amendments. Back in January, February 2021, the county completed a survey, and there were more than 420 people that were surveyed overall. A few of the questions in the survey are particularly relevant to our conversation tonight. So 66% of existing farmers and 77% of prospective farmers are concerned about the lack of integration between habitat protection and protecting working farmlands. Additionally, survey respondents identified a top priority of making permitting easier for conservation enhancement projects. This feedback also echoes what we heard from the Agricultural Advisory Committee and the Thurston Conservation District during our more recent stakeholder outreach this summer.
For me,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to grasp the lack of integration of habitat protection and protecting working farmlands. What is? I'm just
Yeah.
not grasping that.
So it would be like using conservation practices to, let's say, allow some type of agricultural use within a buffer area, and to essentially not apply strict buffers with recognition that there are farming practices that are more conservation oriented.
So they're looking to allow more of that type of farming in the buffers?
More conservation oriented farming practices. So you can do regenerative ag, you can do different kinds of hedgerows, riparian buffers and things of that nature. You can do rotational grazing. And all those are going to help mitigate for any adverse impacts that you may see from agricultural uses.
And so that kind of farming, would that apply or help with the no net loss piece?
They would have to document it. So part of the discussion tonight is how do we treat new ag uses? Is it appropriate to have, just an application of Title 24 in a critical areas ordinance, or more of a conservation planning approach where you would identify what kind of ag activities and facilities are going to be occurring, identify what those impacts are, and then look to see if there are conservation practices that can help mitigate for it, with the understanding that there does need to be no net loss at the end. That makes sense.
Go ahead, Commissioner Wheatley.
Yeah, just for clarification, so is the idea that, because you said that the VSP programs, new agriculture can't do VSP programs, right? So is the concept to expand the availability of VSP to include new or?
And not exactly, because you've got that disconnect of measuring no net loss on a watershed basin level and that benchmark being 2011 versus having to look at, a benchmark like today or moving forward, and then having a site-specific analysis of that no net loss. So any mitigation measures or conservation practices would have to happen on that site and incorporated into that new ag use. But we will definitely be getting into a little bit more of that. You guys you're moving ahead faster than I am.
Commissioner Messinger, you had more?
Yeah, one other question. Does timber farming and or aquaculture included in this definition of agriculture?
So aquaculture would be part of the Shoreline Master Program. Timber farming, we'd have to dig into that a little bit. Are you talking about silviculture or
Just
traditional
curious
farming?
whether either of them are at all included under this.
I have the definition right here. I'm just going to look at it really quick because it is defined by the state. I know agroforestry is included, but a lot of that is sort of cutting edge in terms of like there's encouraging more agroforestry, but there isn't a lot of documentation for it. Yeah, I'd have to look a little bit further into that, but that's a good question.
Thank you.
So we also looked at what other jurisdictions are doing. I think I looked at pretty much every county in Western Washington and some in Eastern Washington, both counties that are enrolled in voluntary stewardship program as well as counties that are not. And there's a lot of documentation also included in the Department of Commerce's Critical Areas Handbook. So when you look at what other jurisdictions are doing, there's a range. So the state requires counties to protect critical areas for newer expanded agricultural uses, but there are different approaches for doing this. So on the left, you'll see this is an approach that leverages partnerships and prioritizes flexibility. So this would be one more akin to our VSP program. So jurisdictions that have gone this direction allow new and expanded ag uses subject to a conservation plan. Call it kind of whatever you want, but that's sort of the most common terminology. It would be prepared by technical service provider. So that would be like our Thurston Conservation District or some other NRCS technical service provider. It would be approved by the county though. So whereas VSP, those plans are approved by Thurston Conservation District because they're looking at everything on a watershed basin level. These would have to be approved by the county, but there would be specific measures written into the code and what other jurisdictions have to retain the privacy of those farmers. And as a default, these jurisdictions also allow proposals to just comply with the critical areas ordinance if that is the route that they want to pick. Another approach, this one in the middle, this is much like what's in 1715 today, it's kind of like special ag-related provisions for critical areas. And so like what's in 1715 today are special provisions for reduction of wetland, buffers, special provisions for groundwater protection. It looks very similar to Title 24, but it is just focused on ag. And so, you know, an approach like this would be Title 24 with maybe a special section for ag built into these critical areas protections. The remaining counties, and you'll see the 3 listed there, Skagit, Lewis, and Whatcom, those are all big farming communities. They just require new agricultural activities and facilities to go through their existing critical areas ordinance with no special provisions for ag. And I have not reached out to them to talk to them about, you know, why that approach and not another. But that's kind of the range of what's out there today. So based on what we've heard and looking at the agricultural or the ag survey, as well as talking to Thurston Conservation District and the Agricultural Advisory Committee, we would like to explore developing a code amendment package with a conservation plan option for new ag. So this would mean that there'd be multiple pathways to critical areas ordinance compliance for these newer expanded agricultural uses. This approach would build on the VSP program. It would balance protection of critical areas while recognizing the importance of working farmlands. It would hopefully provide more flexibility and opportunities to incentivize things like conservation enhancement projects and climate smart activities. Finally, this approach would reflect guidance from the Department of Commerce's Critical Areas Handbook. And this is kind of wordy, but I do want to read it because it was fairly impactful when I read it. So conservation plans are intended to help agricultural operators maintain productive and economically viable agricultural land while protecting and enhancing critical areas and water quality using best available science and effective mitigation measures. Conservation plans can effectively reduce impacts from farm activities on natural resources with solutions unique to each farm to avoid or minimize adverse impacts with mitigation techniques. So hopefully that answers your first question, Commissioner Simmons, about sort of the role of conservation plans as they pertain. So I promise I'll be done talking in a minute because I really want to hear your thoughts and ideas. I wanted to, based on like research into what other counties are doing and looking at our VSP program, I did want to at least provide you an outline of what the conservation plan approach would include, probably at a minimum, or, you know, if there are things missing, or now we can add those in there. But as I mentioned, other counties do have these plans prepared by a technical service provider, but reviewed and approved by the county. The plans would have to identify the benchmarks and mitigation measures tied to whatever impacts are identified, ensuring that site-specific no net loss. We would want to partner with the farmers and have them participate in the ongoing monitoring and adaptive management as prescribed in the plan. And you know, if after quite a few attempts things aren't working, county would be able to enforce those plans. Conservation plans in general, they address farm size, the critical area, soil types and the slope of land, waste and manure piles and how they're treated, surface water, water flow controls, water treatment and management, the type of crops or livestock, machinery and ag buildings. And then those plans would also include goals, maps, scope and timeline, an implementation plan, and monitoring and compliance is that important piece for demonstrating no net loss. So, sorry, that was a lot of talking, but now I want to open it up. Is this the direction we should be going in, or should we be looking at more that, you know, writing specific provisions for ag, or just having new ag added as a use in Title 24 critical areas ordinance? And if we do go with like the conservation plan approach, what opportunities are we missing? What should be baked into this? What's important? How might we structure incentives for conservation enhancement projects or those climate smart practices and things of that nature.
Yeah, I have an observation, just, full disclosure, I'm also a volunteer on the Thurston Conservation District Board of Supervisors. So I have an interest in VSPs and the like. I don't know as much about it as I really ought to, but I know that the demand for those programs is higher than the capacity of the Conservation District to meet the demand. The Conservation District is constantly hiring new people, which is great. It's growing, but it always seems to have, be filling maybe like half of the requests, right? It can't keep up with the demand, which is really exciting. It's great. There's a lot of interest, but it raises some concerns about the capacity to really do a good job with this. I mean, if, I'm thinking about, well, what does it mean to sort of hand this over to a technical TSP, and, given the high level of expertise and knowledge about the county that the staff of the Conservation District have. So I'm a little bit worried about it sort of outrunning, the capacity to do a good job. So that's just, that's one thing. A question something to maybe think about rolling in there. I know that another concern that's based on that survey is about affordability of farmland and about sort of succession between generations. And I'm wondering if there might be some way to roll transfer of development rights into consideration of this, like whether, since this is talking about, in a way extending farm use into this new area, theoretically, it might improve the value of the land too. So a TDR might be, requiring it or something, might be a way to keep the value of the land still low. So it's just something to think about, because I know there's a lot of interest in TDR too. Transfer of development rights.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
I think, so the thing about transfer of development rights, I think we're going to go to rabbit hole here, but I have some fundamental opposition to the idea because it relies on an artificial cap on development somewhere else that sets it lower than market demand. So you can have that difference between what people want to build and what they can build and use that to fund the transfer. So I would think it would be preferable to be thinking more about purchase of development rights, like sale of development rights.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I was also going to raise that same question about capacity for the technical service providers. I think Scott, you mentioned it a couple of weeks ago, that it's a barrier. Sometimes if you create a new demand, you might be able to basically build up a system to meet that demand if it's actually there versus something that's kind of spotty and sporadic. So that could be a benefit.
Yeah, I'd say on the transfer of development rights, it's something Thurston County's had for 30 years and it's gone nowhere because the cities aren't interested.
Well, yeah, maybe Derek's approach is smarter. Yeah.
Have any big grand ideas on this yet?
Um,
That you want to share, I should say?
well, the first little one on the addresses up there, machinery, I would not worry about that because that can turn over so fast, and crops or livestock, you can kind of, like I did one of these plans on a dairy once. And so we had a plan and it was different based on what type of crop we were going to grow. So you can put that in and you can give people options. The other thing was the 2011 VSP date, but our critical areas ordinance exempts ag that was existing in 2012, whatever the date that was passed.
Look into that. I know when I talked to Sarah, she thought it was a date from the 90s. That was, Sarah Moorhead at Thurston Conservation
Because
District.
it was, so when the critical areas came out, it actually Thurston County's critical areas is one of the things that led to the voluntary stewardship program. But so there was a state law that said that critical areas cannot affect existing agriculture. And so that was, whatever date that was that the CAO was actually passed, is the date that Thurston County has for existing agriculture that's exempt from critical areas ordinance.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
I'm not sure if you have an answer to this, but can you say a little bit more about the monitoring and compliance piece and to whom that would fall?
I don't have a complete answer. I mean, of the counties that have gone this route, there's only about 2 that have very detailed monitoring and compliance sections. And so we'd probably try to build off of them, reach out to them and see how it's been working, so that we're not starting from scratch. I think definitely using adaptive management, having the new role of the agricultural community program manager that the county will be hiring would be an important piece to all of this, working and being a liaison with development services as well as a technical service provider. In the research I've seen, there's a lot of deference to the farmer. So no surprise visits, a lot of like 2 to 3 week notice, meeting them on site, and really trying to work through, updates to the conservation plan rather than just moving straight to enforcement.
So right now, the county, most of its enforcement is done on a complaint basis. Would you foresee this as being another one that is done on a complaint-driven basis, or would this be something where you would schedule a periodic inspection, maybe once every 5 years or 10 years or something? I have no idea.
So when I did chat with Sarah at Thurston Conservation District about this, and she said it would really depend on what the proposal is, whether it would make sense to check in sort of after that first year and have it be a friendly, like, is it working? What do we need to change in the conservation plan, and have it be with the technical service provider. And then maybe after that, it could be every 2 years or every 3 years. And that's one of the reasons that I think having the monitoring and compliance be a piece that has to be in the conservation plan is important, but spelling out exactly what it looks like might not provide the flexibility that would be helpful to have based on what the use is.
A couple of questions. What is the cost to the farmer for the conservation plan and the monitoring and compliance portion?
So right now, there is no cost, which is why there's such a high demand. There are technical service providers you can hire, and the cost of those, I guess I've only talked to them about forest management plans, but they also did farm management plans. It was about $1,200 to $2,500 for that particular nonprofits, usually nonprofits. There are other technical service providers through NRCS that could do this outside of Thurston Conservation District. I'm not sure what their capacity is. And it is a program that like you could go and get certified through NRCS to do this. There is one county, I think it's Clark County, that has their own program of certification, sort of farmer certification for being able to draft up conservation plans. Another thing, if we're throwing out concepts, another thing that, I wish I could remember which county it was. They had sort of 2 tracks. They had sort of you don't need a full-blown conservation plan prepared by a technical service provider.
Skagit County.
Is it Skagit? No, Skagit is the one, you just have to go straight. They're not VSP, so
They used to do that. They had a 3-tier approach.
Yeah, so that is another, you wouldn't necessarily get as much flexibility, but if you had a simple proposal, like you're an existing ag use and you're putting in a shed, for covering animal waste, and you're not necessarily going to be affecting a critical area buffer, like there'd be another way an easier path to go through.
If you if we did go down this particular path and you do get it, you engage a TSP, but then it's still gonna be approved by the county, could we skip the step up? Like if you have a really adept and in tune farmer that can write his own VSP, does he really need a TSP if the county is going to approve it anyways? Like I imagine Scott, since he's written these before, if he wanted to write his own. Or
He'll be the first one signing up for that
yeah, maybe
citizen.
he is in tune enough that he could do his own and it would be a good document. Does there really need to be a certification plan if the county is going to be approving it anyway, since they're going to be the final arbiter? Do they care who's stamping? It's not like engineering. You
It's
don't have to have a
not
stamp
a
on it.
stamp, it's more that technical knowledge that they're
Right.
bringing.
And we will have to, we can look into that. But the conservation plan is the synonym to a mitigation and monitoring plan that we would typically get under a critical area ordinance. And under the CAO, a professional needs to be the one that creates that plan. So we can definitely take a look and talk to the counties to see if that has been working for them, if they do that. But we don't necessarily want to set people up for failure because they submit something that they think works. And we come back and say, I'm sorry, this isn't going to work. We charge them every time we have another hour added on to that base fee. So we'll definitely take a look to see if that works.
I guess my concern is if a farmer writes his own, he's probably squared away enough that he actually understands the nuts and bolts of it. But if he goes and hires out a TSP, he might just be checking boxes and not really understand it. And I would imagine that the guy that writes his own actually does a better job at this.
Maybe not.
But I could be wrong.
I've gone around with Thurston Conservation District, and when they do this, VSP used to sit under me. Well, I guess it's technically still does, but anyway, I used to be more involved with that. And it is a very hands-on program that they do. They walk the property with the farmer or the producer, and they go through all of it. So in the end, when the product that they hand the producer is final, they understand what needs to be done and hit the ground running. So.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well,
No, please tell me I'm wrong.
It's just that, it's not just expertise about farming, it's expertise about the critical area as well and how to mesh the two. So that's where the expertise really comes in. And awareness of the practices, and especially if it has to be compliant with, USDA requirements or something like that.
The other thing that they are so knowledgeable about is that tie-in from the conservation plan that we may require for critical areas compliance, but then could also be a vehicle for funding opportunities, grant opportunities. Like they're that connection point. And that's one of the added benefits or incentives of even going through VSP is that all of a sudden as a farmer, you become potentially eligible for all of these other programs. So we would try to design it with that in mind so that it's not just a document that's used for one purpose, but that it could be used
Well, if
for
we do
other
have a
purposes.
TSP capacity issue, it wouldn't hurt my feelings if we found a way to widen that lane. Go ahead.
You mentioned that there are 2 counties that currently have a very good monitoring and compliance program.
More detail in their code. And so that doesn't always translate into it being implemented well, which is why I'd want to just reach out and chat with them about how it's been working. If I remember correctly, I think it is Clark and I could tell you really quickly. Oh, well, I think I'm sorry. No, Wacom is just straight critical areas. Yeah, I could easily answer that once I went back to the doc. There's just a lot more counties in that bucket than in the other buckets.
No, because it makes it easier than to go to that county's website, look up agriculture and take a look at it. The other question I had is, this is just pertaining to farms or new farms that are developing agriculture in a critical area, not ones that are not in a critical area.
Correct, they have to have that nexus.
Okay.
So I think, going back to what we were talking about earlier, I don't remember, I'm pretty sure it was Gadget, but it might have been somebody else. When we were talking about this a long time ago, actually somebody from the conservation district up there came down to an ag committee meeting. And they had a 3-tiered critical areas. There was, obviously, if you just want to get a permit, you go to the county, you get your permit. There was a checklist type permit where it wasn't like a big thing, so they just do like a checklist, you meet all these, and the county approves you. And then there was this plan where you have your actual conservation plan. So, and the other thing, probably gonna be different for the county, but for most farm plans, monitoring and compliance is like, you need to build a fence in this area. And they come out and okay, you still have the fence up, it's still hot. If it's electric, that's their monitoring and compliance in most of the farm plans that I've been around. We said you should put your cows here, are they still here? We said you need to apply manure between these dates. Are you still doing that?
So, I guess I'm hearing that conservation plan might be a direction we want to go in.
I agree.
Is everyone, the commissioners online, is that something, the approach that you'd like us to move forward with?
I think so.
Sorry, I'll stop.
Yeah, so
Sounds good to me.
Commissioner Carmen
Agreed.
Hanson. Yes. Go ahead, Kevin.
Just saying agreed.
Okay, great. Before we move off this subject though, I want to see if there's any interest from like Commissioner Wheatley or Commissioner Nelson, if they would be interested in doing subcommittee work on this, if they have the time for that. That's something that.
I'm not gonna have time for the next couple of months, so I don't know what
Let's
schedule is.
Let's noodle on that a little bit to see if there's enough interest for our subcommittee work on it. And if there is, then we can push it that direction. But as it is right now, the conservation plan direction looks like the one to go towards.
Okay.
Did you have anything else?
No.
I've got one more.
Okay.
You had the groups that you're talking with. I might also, I'm sure Chris has the list, reach out to the actual VSP working group. We had a group that did a lot of work on it. So,
Well, thank you very much. This was
No.
really helpful.
Thank you very much. All right, we'll be moving on now with a continued business with a work session and recommendation possibility on the wireless code update with Mayor Caitlin Nelson.
Good evening, planning commissioners.
My name is Caitlin Nelson. At the last work session, we had talked about setbacks, allowed zones, and preferred locations, and it was one of the, while those were some of the last major topics that we had planned to discuss. I'm going to share my screen here. You have received 2 documents from me for this meeting, one with track changes and annotations explaining what was changing from the original draft and why, and then a version without the markups. The changes reflect what we have talked about in previous work sessions, as well as some corrections and changes for grammar. You can see here on the screen, I have some of the places that Okay. I have on the screen some of the locations in the draft that were changed based on the last discussion. Here I have the zoning table where we had talked about making certain kinds of facilities in certain zones permitted through administrative instead of a hearing examiner. I also have here the language that we had talked about for preferred locations, those zones, and then the table that we had discussed. One additional piece of code that is not in your draft that I want to address is under prohibited locations. And I had mentioned this briefly at a previous work session, and that was regarding language on wetlands. And just as a reminder, this is not in the packet that you received.
Okay.
Huh?
I was looking.
Yeah, a few of you were. This was a request from current planners that review this that noticed that it was not in it, and they were correct. It should have been. And so I have this up here. I will read it. It is just in addition to prohibited areas, and it is WCFs and associated structures shall not be located within 1,000 feet of wetlands, staging areas, or rookeries supporting birds listed as priority species by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, listed as endangered or threatened species under the Federal Endangered Species Act. Sorry, I need to correct myself. Part of this is in your packet. There has been a change to the amount of feet setback. So in the draft, it says 100 because that is consistent with the other setbacks that are in the code. 1,000 feet is what's in our existing code. And with our legal review, they determined that that is appropriate for this. So we can keep that in here. So just to clarify, I am drafting it to be 1,000 feet, not 100. Are there any concerns with that?
Commissioner Pestinger, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to ask about what 100 feet didn't seem like enough, so thank you for that. But this is also specific to wetlands, staging areas, or rookeries supporting birds. Are there any other critical habitats that might also want to be under this consideration?
Not in the draft.
Not in the draft. There are, if I'm remembering correctly, the existing code references staying out of critical areas. And part of the reasoning why this can be a bigger setback than others that we have in the code is specifically because it's related to birds. So I guess for other areas that would need some consultant consideration. But I don't recall other sections of the existing code that that have any kind of setback like this other than staying out of critical areas. Yeah.
Okay, maybe that's enough with the critical areas. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any grief about keeping 1,000 feet between these?
No.
I think everybody thinks that's a pretty good idea.
Okay. In that case, Chair, you have received a draft motion.
I have not.
You have not.
You have a question?
Go ahead, Commissioner.
Under approval authority, 20.54.015, you have one administrative approval, and then you have the table 1.
Yes.
But I don't see any second paragraph under approval authority. Is that because it's all contained in the table then?
What page you got?
10. Page 10. Oh, it's 10 in mine. It's before that, up a little bit. Right, the next one up. Next page, right there. Oh, so you go from approval authority, subparagraph 1, and I understand all that. It doesn't look like there's any subparagraph 2. So the only one that I see approval authority defined is for administrative approval. So is there somewhere other subparagraphs that talks about the special use permit or something like that, other than the agenda? I guess I don't even call it agenda down below. It's kind of like the describing what the X's and A's are in the table.
Just next.
Okay, so I pulled up the municipal code website. Special use, we have purpose and intent, approval authority, administrative approval.
Right.
Um,
That kind of cuts off there.
Okay, the second paragraph is hearing examiner approval, and then it's a general statement of the approval authority for all other special use permits, including. Yeah, so,
So that language will be included.
yeah, there's no changes to it, but I will include it.
Yeah, I just didn't see a subparagraph 2 hearing examiner approval for the other ones.
That's fair, yeah. And since we're not making any changes to that, I can make that change in the bill format and we don't need to review that again.
Okay.
That was the only.
That's the one we have. Does anybody in the boardroom have anything else on this item? What about, does anybody else have any questions online for Caitlin?
I do.
Go ahead, Commissioner Pestinger.
So also looking at that table on page 11, I'm not maybe expert at reading some of those zoning designations, but my biggest question is, are there any residential areas that are included in the preferred areas? It looks like some of the residential zoning ones don't have an A or an X in them. Are there any residential areas included?
For tower structures, which is mainly what, let me start over. The preferred area language is mainly related to tower structures. So we changed some of the zoning table to be administrative for towers in other zones. We did not determine any residential areas that those would be preferred. For co-locations and attached facilities, those are administrative across the board because of the shot clock, because we don't have enough time for that to go to a hearing examiner. So those are considered preferred just in the way that we have set up our code. If that makes sense.
Just clarification,
Okay.
I'm trying to remember, I can't take it where it was, but I saw something about neighborhood convenience areas being like prioritized maybe over residential or something like that.
Oh, it was, yes. We had talked about, I think when we had looked at this language, you were not here, but we had talked about making towers an administrative permitted use as a preferred area if it were in a commercial area or an industrial area, and neighborhood convenience fell under commercial in our discussions.
I had some more questions. Let me know when you want me to continue.
Go ahead, Commissioner Pestinger.
Okay. Going back to the definition section, I noticed there's a definition there for small wireless facilities. Maybe it's already in there, but we're not making any changes to it, but I couldn't find any definition for either macro towers or macro facilities. Is that something that's included already, but we're just not making changes to the definition? Hello?
Sorry, I'm looking through
Oh, okay.
what we have. I believe we had originally talked about identifying macro facilities and then determined that it was unnecessary because it fell under
Base station.
towers and base stations. We weren't using it anywhere else in our code for the moment. So I believe we removed it.
I only raised a question. I saw macro towers referenced once and macro facilities referenced a couple times in here.
Right.
Anyways, next question. So I have a concern that it feels like we seem to be excluding small wireless facilities from a number of requirements. And I'm not sure quite why we're so liberal with that. On page 17, specifically section, I think it's a continuation of part 1 on page 16. There's a new addition, says for purposes of this title, a standalone pole in the right of way, the sole or primary purpose of which is to house small wireless facilities shall not be treated as a tower, but are still required to obtain the appropriate special use permit. I'm just curious, why is a small wireless facility not treated as a tower?
Because it would be considered either an attachment or a co-location.
Okay.
If it was a new structure that a small wireless facility would be attaching to, that is considered a tower.
Okay. Going to page 21, waiver of submittal requirements. Again, this allows a pretty broad waiver here. Well, not broad. It's actually more specific, but still, it allows for waivers. And as our fellow planning commissioners have pointed out, if it can be waived, it's not a requirement. That's also true, I think, on another requirement later in the document. On page 23 for time frame for review, I know that we felt like the shot clocks were pretty tight, but is there any of these options that we can include a better public notification element on? I know that we just say the public notification is the public needs to check. They would of their own accord need to make an inquiry as to whether something has been submitted and an application has been submitted. That's our version of public notification. Is there any way we can go above that level of public notification for any of these options on page 23?
Okay. So really quickly, just to address your comment about the waiver of requirements. Anywhere in this draft code that it mentions wavering requirements is strictly for flexibility for the county to meet the federal laws with changes in technology. So if we accidentally create code that is preventing wireless facilities to be distributed in the county, we would be going against federal law. And so we would be waiving those requirements strictly to meet that. For the time frame for review, the issue is that since we only have a certain amount of days to review them, they would fall under either our administrative permit review process or our hearing examiner review process. And whether or not there's public participation and notice is already determined in those types of permits. So if we were to go beyond that, it would most likely need to be a decision from the Board of County Commissioners to have some kind of a separate process.
Okay.
Right.
Further questions on page 26, noise reduction measures. It simply says noise reduction measures must comply with applicable county or Washington state noise regulations. That really does not seem strong enough. Later, there's even an opportunity for a reduction in setback. It says in section 7CI, if the applicant uses visual or noise abatement techniques, such as decorative noise walls, to achieve equivalent or greater reduction of visual and noise impacts from the WCF. So we know that noise reduction measures could be possible. It seems like we're, I mean, that's one of the number one complaints where people are saying, I don't want this thing right next to my residence, and noise is a factor in that concern. And it just seems like we know county and state regulations are very lax on noise. Seems we could do better here. I also have a huge concern in that setbacks of section CII, where, and I just want to know if I understand this straight. It says, for example, on a 100-foot tall tower with a break point at 80 feet, the minimum setback distance would be 22 feet. And then it explains that calculation. Is that saying that 22 feet, it could be 22 feet from a residence if it had a break point in the tower at 80 feet? 22 feet seems very close. There's a similar question on spacing on page 27 in section 8B1 or B1B. It says in zones that allow residential uses, the towers must not be closer than 200 feet or 100% of the tower height from the nearest residential dwelling. Does that mean if it's only a 40-foot high tower, then that could only be 40 feet away from a residential dwelling? Again, it seems not nearly enough.
Where's that?
And then the last thing I'll mention is in the section about, on page 28, 29, about co-locating WCFs. It talks about when they co-locate and it changes the height of the facility, they're allowed to go up to 30 feet more. Do making changes to those heights change then their setback requirements? And that's it for me.
Commissioner Wheatley, did you
Well, no, I'll wait.
wait for a response?
Yeah.
I think I would need to digest more of it in order to provide more of a response. I think at this point, we have reviewed a bit of this. If the planning commission would like these to be considered, I would most likely need to come back with that information. But that's up to you as a group.
Do you think the commission is ready for, just to get a feel for the room, to see if this needs to move forward yet, or do these issues need to be addressed specifically?
Can we move forward with some clarification at the public hearing, or does it have to be all done before?
This will all be rehashed again at the BOCC level. Yeah, and it will be rehashed in a minority report if there is not a unanimous decision. With that, I would entertain a motion. If anybody had one. Well,
I have one question before I move on.
go ahead.
So you mentioned, I think it's reasonable that a lot of the requirements can be waived for FCC compliance. Is that explicit in the current version of the code? That's the reason for a waiver or an exemption?
No, I'm not sure how recommended it is to put that.
I think, so if the goal is specifically making sure it's durable with FCC regulations, that should be what's written in the code versus it being kind of blanket authority for the county to waive it.
It would need to go for review from our legal team.
Well, I think that's a good enough question right there that maybe spending a little more time on this, if you could bring those questions back and then we'll do another shot on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need
Some answers.
some answers, or at least some clarification on some of the things that have been asked. But I'll say, as far as the waiver that we're talking about here, it's a waiver of submittal. So it's not a waiver of regulations, it's just a waiver of, something.
There's
the county
actually
wants to
waiver
have it turned
requirements
on.
as well.
Yeah, my question or comment was on the same chunk there.
Okay.
One of them was, I was just, wondering how likely, how urgent is the need for that section really? I mean, we kind of had a conversation before about, what's the real risk to the county if it doesn't have something like that in it? And, sometimes I think this whole thing kind of goes overboard in cautiousness perhaps, given the level of punishment that the county potentially faces if it doesn't do it. I mean, we had a conversation about that, that sometimes the risk is very, very minimal. And I'm wondering if this is, I'd be curious to know what the level of risk would be not to have this in here, to the county. And then I think Derek's question was, or suggestion was better, but I was just wondering what would happen if you took out part of the sentence, would prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting wireless communications. And then after that, the or is otherwise not needed for review for compliance. What if you just took that out? How much of a difference would that make? Make it more specific. Maybe going to Derek's point.
I think, because that is like the effect of prohibiting wireless communications, that is the federal standard that you're trying to not infringe on. So the or just kind of opens it up to kind of very, very, very broad discretion.
Yeah, so that or, after that or. That's on page 21 at the top of the page.
Is there any other concerns on this before we send her back for more review? All right, I think we kind of loaded your plate back up.
Okay. Thank you.
No, thank you. All right. Well, with that, we'll move on to our next session, which is a work session on docket item A24, the emergency housing ordinance with Planner Ray Davis.
Good evening, Commissioners. Leah Davis with Community Planning. You might know me as the ambitious planner with a planner with an ambitious schedule. So Maya People and I introduced the emergency housing ordinance at the last meeting on July 6th. Tonight, Maya is going to begin by sharing some information that did not make it into the memo for this topic. Please hold all questions till the end of my presentation. Thank you. Maya?
Thanks, Leah. And yes, we are asking that you hold questions to the end of the presentation tonight in order for us to make it through the full thing. We did leave plenty of time to go over your questions, so jot them down and then we'll just have a rapid fire at the end. But at the last meeting on July 6th, the Planning Commission did have a couple of questions about the ordinance and ways to improve it, and also some of the barriers that might exist to folks applying for homeless encampments. And so most of these questions are answered in the memorandum, and I won't go over that in detail, but if you want to browse that and bring questions to the end of the meeting, we're happy to address them. But I do want to touch on some feedback that I received following this memo going out to all of you, and so it didn't make it in there. And just as a reminder, the scope of this docket item that we're talking about tonight is very narrow. It's just a code update to ensure that the homeless encampments ordinance works smoothly and that we have some flexibility in permitting requirements when there's a declared emergency, which helps us get unsheltered people into a sanctioned shelter a little bit more quickly. It does not address any of these other things that are also ongoing. Different programs in the county that handle affordable housing, handle mental health services, drug abuse, income support. All of those other things also work towards the homelessness crisis, but it's not part of this docket item. So what we're talking about today is really narrow in scope. But some of the questions that I received responses on following that memo going out to the Planning Commission were in regards to barriers for folks who might apply for a sanctioned homeless encampment under the Thurston County Code. So I did reach out to Public Health and Social Services, and they noted that a couple of things that could be barriers to folks applying. These sorts of camps are very costly, and also the application cost is somewhat significant, and also support moving through the permit process. So Public Health and Social Services was the entity that applied last fall, and they got to go through the process firsthand. They said there were a lot of interdepartmental meetings, and it was just very burdensome to understand kind of what the requirements were. So all of those types of barriers are things that we would not address specifically under this code update, but we can continue having those conversations with development services on the other side, kind of concurrently to this. So not necessarily part of the docket item or things that the Planning Commission will review, but now that we are aware that those are issues, we can continue to have those conversations. Other things that Public Health and Social Services noted as potential barriers are may versus must when it comes to using identification as a intake method at a homeless encampment. And currently the draft language that it has been attached to your packet tonight does use may instead of must, and that change has been in effect since the original interim ordinance went in place in 2019. Public Health and Social Services notes that that is a significant barrier reducer. So having that in place is a huge help to getting folks to apply in the first place, and also getting folks into these homeless encampments once they've already been permitted. And finally, PHSS did note that there are some current concerns with having a list that the sheriff's office has access to. So right now the code does require that camps maintain a list of folks who spend overnight at the camp. And there were concerns about having that information be available to the sheriff's office if need be. So Leah and I did check in with our legal team, and they said that there's no issues with retaining that information, and that information would be subject to be available if there were any sort of incident anyways. So it's not necessarily protected information, but we did run that by just to be sure. And the second piece that I wanted to touch on that also didn't make it into the memo was numbers on affordable housing units. So Commissioner Hefferson asked this question at the last meeting, and wanted to know how many new affordable housing units have been in place since the 2019 comprehensive plan update. And I did include some general information that I had found through the National Housing and Preservation Database, which said there had been 253 units that have come online since 2019. But PHSS has also indicated, and they track separately, there have been 260 units over 10 different projects that the county alone has funded since 2019. And not all of those projects have been fully constructed yet. So not all of those affordable housing units are available to folks at this time, but many of them are in progress and slated to be complete over the next year or 2 years. So that's a significant bump. That almost doubles that number. I also reached out to Thurston Regional Planning Council to see if they had information on the number of affordable housing units, and they did not. They indicated that there is no county-wide inventory where we collect this kind of data, and that has been identified as a specific data gap through the housing plans with the cities and Thurston County. So there are some ongoing efforts through TRPC and with the cities and the county to find out how we can better address that and how we can collect that data moving forward. So those are just some tidbits that did not make it into the memo, but I'm going to hand it back to Leah. We'll go through our PowerPoint, and then at the end, we will take questions. So we have a fairly short PowerPoint, and we'll be happy to open it up for discussion after that.
Thanks, Maya. So tonight we're going to focus on the code amendments to the emergency housing ordinance and hopefully set a public hearing for August. And we do want public input as early as possible on this project. So let's see. So this is docket item A24 on the official development code docket. It will impact titles 20, 21, 22, and 23. At the last work session, we covered the history of the homeless encampments ordinance, the emergency housing ordinance, what other jurisdictions are doing, and other related policies. Today, we'll focus on the amendments. So these code amendments will not address unpermitted homeless encampments or serve as a standalone solution to homelessness. This is just one small way to regulate where people without homes, where and how people without homes can lay down and sleep. The proposed amendments would make the interim regulations permanent with some minor adjustments. The adjustments would clarify the application requirements, the permitting process, and change the permit review and appeals process for just this specific application. The interim regulations were adopted in 2019 and renewed by the Board of County Commissioners 5 times. The board also asked staff to find ways to make this ordinance more efficient, which is the ordinance that we will review tonight. It was discovered during the application process in the fall that some additional changes were needed to the application process and the permitting process. These amendments will provide clarity for the department and applicants. So when the board directed staff to make it more effective, community planning worked closely with all other relevant departments to help determine which requirements can be waived. PHSS mostly had questions about the legality of some items. The sheriff's office is not supportive of this ordinance. Development Services requested more clarity on process and procedures. Previous board comments included lifting the ban on weapons, banning only illegal drugs, and allowing multiple methods of identification of residents. We also received and considered comments from the community. I believe the comments were included with your packet tonight.
No, we didn't get comments.
Okay, I thought they were in there. I looked at the,
They were part of.
behind the memo in that same attachment.
Yes, so we did include comments on the electronic packet. However, they were not included in the mailed packet because it was an extra 100 and something pages. So
Yeah,
it's
it was
all
a lot.
available.
Yeah. Yeah, and they were also summarized on some spreadsheets, so if you want a quick look at what's what.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to cause any confusion. So the proposed emergency amendments to the homeless encampments ordinance included regulations the board had previously adopted through the emergency housing ordinance. So it's a section that allows waivers of some regulations that are not directly related to public safety, requires the director to consult with stakeholders prior to waiving any regulations. And it includes fingerprinting as a valid form of ID and removes the prohibition of weapons and allows for prescription drugs. So a list of items that are not waivable, having portable toilets and wash stations and having those screened from neighboring properties, fire safety requirements, meeting building codes for all constructed buildings on site, and having a code of conduct. These requirements may directly affect public health and safety. Some requirements that can be waived include parking standards, proximity to a bus stop, visitor regulations, and a requirement to hold a public meeting. These do not impact public health and safety. The county commissioners have adopted all of these waivers at 6 different times. So here are the proposed amendments that differ from the interim regulations. The emergency waiver that allows RV dwellers to use their heating and cooking appliances will be made a permanent exception. No longer will an encampment be allowed in critical areas, and language to allow the waivers for the duration of the permit rather than a limited 6-month period. New changes include clarification of regulations and permitting process where we found it was unclear. Updates to references such as calling TCOM dispatch instead of the sheriff's office. A new section for application and review procedures, which includes a process for the director's decision, a review with the Board of County Commissioners, and revises the appeal process, sending any appeal directly to the Superior Court. All these steps are designed to expedite the permitting and appeal process during a public health crisis as requested by the board. The duration for which a camp is allowed, either 180 days or 365 days. In discussion with permitting staff, 180 days is a short period for this type of permit. A longer duration permit would alleviate staff time and reduce the process burden on an applicant. PHSS noted that 6 months is not long enough to see major impacts from other efforts, such as development of more stable temporary housing or affordable housing. So now is the time for questions, and then we'd like to set a public hearing for August. We would like to get that public input and move the process along as the board has requested. So any questions?
Start with Commissioner Day.
Just really quickly, so in the presentation, it says illegal drugs, and then when you spoke, you said prescription drugs?
Yeah, they used to ban all drugs, and then they realized that what they meant was illegal drugs, and so they made an allowance for prescription, so I just clarified it in that one.
Okay, so it's,
So they do allow prescription drugs.
but not other legal drugs.
Correct.
Hard to tell what's legal and illegal.
Sure you can't see my.
I have a question.
We'll start with Commissioner Carmen.
Yeah, why are we allowing weapons?
Because of the Second Amendment.
Yes, Commissioner Carmen, that actually came up explicitly between the Board of County Commissioners and planning staff when we first drafted this ordinance back in 2019. And that change was made at the request of the Board of County Commissioners, noting that we may not necessarily be able to prohibit someone from carrying a weapon if they have a concealed weapons permit and a right to bring it. So there were concerns over Second Amendment rights on prohibiting that. And that's where that change has come from.
Yeah, but the sponsor could prohibit it, right?
That's a legal question, maybe. I don't know.
Well, they can, I'm sure that they can not allow someone to come in because of that.
The sponsor can have more stringent requirements than the county requires.
Correct.
Yeah.
There's nothing in the ordinance that would prohibit the sponsor from creating more restrictive requirements.
Anything else, Commissioner Carmen?
No.
Commissioner Pestinger?
Thank you, Chair. Just a question about the one of the things I've heard a lot of public commentary about was the concern over proximity to possible water sources, streams, groundwater contamination, anything like that. And that seems like a safety measure the county would be able to have control over. Maybe it's written into the regulations, but I looked through it and I saw a lot of regulations about screening off of portable toilets. I saw regulations around fire usage, but I couldn't find actual regulations about proximity. Because even with portable toilets there's going to be a fair amount of A, garbage that could cause some pollution, and B, still raw sewage that's not getting into the portable toilets that could cause contamination of the water.
No homeless encampment is allowed in a critical area. Most of those surface water and wetlands and that type of habitat are critical areas, so they would be protected.
I was wondering if that would cover enough, but I've still heard stories about them being close to water sources, so just wanted
And
to
so,
ask.
Commissioner, previously that was not listed as a requirement. So the critical areas piece in the interim regulations was actually a waivable requirement. And we identified that as we were reviewing this for this round of update with the permanent, considering these regulations to be permanent, we identified that as a need in order to protect those areas. So we've added that back in as a requirement. It cannot be waived anymore under the proposed amendments that you're seeing tonight. So that could be why we've heard it in the past. I do know there are some unsanctioned homeless encampments that are nearby to water bodies. And so a lot of the comments that we hear from citizens are related to those camps that are not actually permitted.
That's a good point. Thank you.
Commissioner Wheatley?
Oh, if Commissioner Pestinger is done. Okay. Yeah, this is actually a clarification here at the on page 6. I'm thinking, I'm sort of pondering quite a bit the time frames of this stuff, and like I have this really big question about when is a crisis over, and how do you establish standards for that? And I have a comment about that maybe, but on page 6, I'm a little confused about how two parts of this mesh together for the diversions from interim ordinance. It says extends the time for which requirements may be waived from 6 months for the public hearing to so long as the public health emergency exists. And then under the very next paragraph, under new amendments, it says temporary homeless encampments are currently permitted for 6 months and must apply for an extension. Suggested amendment to extend to a 1-year time limit on temporary homeless encampments and to allow for a one-time extension of the temporary use permit. So I guess maybe part of it is that what we're talking, is temporary homeless encampments different to what we're talking about here in terms of emergency housing?
Well, there are two different ordinances that we've been working with. The one that's been adopted since 2010, which is in the code and allows homeless encampments with restrictions and regulations. And then since 2019, because there are so many homeless people, the Board of Health declared homelessness a public health crisis with a bunch of criteria that I put in the memo outlining why they declared that. And since then, they've had the emergency housing ordinance has to be renewed every 6 months. There has to be an ongoing public health crisis, and then it has to be renewed through a Board of County Commissioners public hearing to renew it. And this new ordinance would allow a temporary homeless encampment for say 180 days or 365 days with an extension perhaps. And we wouldn't have to have that public hearing every 6 months to renew it, which is what the code currently says. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I guess I'm a little confused about waiving, the requirements may be waived from 6 months. I'm assuming it means requirements for a specific permitted.
The waivers, any waivers that were granted
Yeah,
are valid for 6 months. And once they expire in the interim ordinance that we're under now, they have to be renewed every 6 months through a public hearing.
so so you could get the waiver, but not yet have established the camp then. I mean, I'm
No,
trying to
they would
understand.
happen at the
timeframe.
same time. They would
Okay.
get their permit, they would apply for a homeless encampment. They would say, well, we aren't close enough to a bus stop, we'd like a waiver on that requirement. And they would consider all of the factors, the director would, and then they would allow that waiver for 6 months. But then that waiver, just the waiver expires. The homeless encampment can be extended, but the waivers expire under the way it is now.
So the waiver can hang around for as long as there's the emergency, but the actual time limit on the encampment is 1 year. with
Well, currently,
possibility
that's
of
the
extension.
proposal, that the waivers be in place as long as there's a public health crisis and as long as the temporary homeless encampment has a permit. The way it is now, the waivers are only good for 6 months. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense that you have an encampment for a year, but the waiver is only good for 6 months, and the waiver goes away, then you got a homeless encampment that doesn't have a waiver, and now they gotta cancel the homeless encampment.
We're trying to rectify that.
Right.
Yeah.
And then on the crisis issue, I'm just thinking about, there's kind of two elements to the public emergency, because I was looking at the point in time surveys, and what I saw, they've been doing them since 2018, and while the overall numbers have declined somewhat, thankfully, the percentage of unhoused has actually increased as a part of that overall number. And so I can imagine a scenario where the health department decides it's not a crisis anymore, and yet the crisis for the unhoused continues because they become a larger and larger part of the overall number of people who are defined as homeless. So I guess, that's just something to think about, like the numbers for the unhoused without shelter are more constant or even prone to increase, even while other groups are going down. I'm wondering if there can be some way of putting that consideration in, or talking to the health department about when the crisis, if a crisis ever ends.
Yeah, it's not actually the health department, it's the Board of Health, which
Board
at
of
this
Health.
time is the Board of County Commissioners. They are the Board
Oh,
of
I
Health.
see.
So they get information from Public Health and Social Services, data that is collected, and they are the people that have made the decision to declare a public health crisis. And I listed a lot of the criteria or the data that they based that on in 2018.
It is outside of the purview of this particular ordinance at this time.
Right.
Yes.
It might be outside the purview, but I actually agree with you, Helen, because the bottom line is that the housing problem for those that don't have shelter is going to increase the next couple of years. That was why I wanted the question answered. I appreciate it, Mia, coming back to us on Chapter 4, Goal 2, Objective B, Policy 2, page 423. But my question is, how many of those 253 and 260 were in unincorporated Thurston County? And how many of those were in city limits? Because it makes a big difference, because the policy from the commissioners is to encourage through their policies housing improvement on, low-income housing? Do you know the answer to that? No?
Well, I mean, just looking at the point in time surveys, which
Yeah.
is certainly not, but what I noticed was the numbers in Olympia,
Yeah.
got massive during the COVID crisis and then went, but the numbers for say Yelm are very constant.
Yeah.
But this is kind of straying off a little farther than where we want to go with this particular ordinance, but I think something that would be part of this ordinance along those lines is, do we have to do all 4 titles? If we decided that we want to have this for the UGAs, but not unincorporated Thurston County?
No, we would not have to, we can. That is correct. We do not have to do
So
all.
if we wanted to, we could make a recommendations, this is for the
For the
UGAs, but or even one of the UGAs and not for the others.
Correct.
So that's something we could consider.
Yes.
Yeah.
As a side note to that, about how much are these permits?
I would have to look those up.
They're not much.
Are these like
$200 or $300.
couple $100?
Yeah.
Not like,
Right.
So a
It's
whole
the
lot less than
permit
like-
isn't the obstacle to getting these camps going.
so a lot less than
Yeah.
like impact fee for a single family home
Oh, yes.
or building permit for a single family.
Oh,
home.
yes. Oh, yes.
Go ahead, Commissioner Day.
So apologies if I'm kind of straying outside the purview here. So I think the prohibitions on illegal drugs and alcohol, I take massive umbrage with. I think if you have prohibitions like that, what we know about people experiencing homelessness, you're essentially creating an environment that they can't live in. This is a non-ordinance. If this is a non-solution, it's unenforceable, but I mean, we have an enforcement, a termination of, a termination and revocation section that talks about if the sponsoring agency fails to take action against residents, like the whole thing can be revoked. I mean, everything, I think we're learning about homelessness, mental health, substance abuse, disorders says that this is a very, very, very misguided policy. I would vote against this ordinance for that reason.
I also still have issues with public meetings being waived away. I really don't want public meetings being waived away.
Yeah. Could I explain? You said I
Sure.
have to do some explaining.
Yeah.
One of them is, one of the reasons is that public meetings take a long time to organize. This is an emergency housing ordinance,
Mhm.
and it's to expedite someplace to put people, say, a group of RVs, whatever. And it's to expedite it. And the waivable requirements are those that do not impact public health and safety. And this one doesn't impact public health and safety. Other things like not having toilets or wash stations and those types of things that are not waivable may directly impact public health and safety. So it's about being expeditious, and it's about public health and safety for the residents and for the people outside, for
Well,
anyone.
I appreciate the explanation, but I'm still
Yeah.
not convinced.
Okay,
I think that these permits, I mean, they're a 30-day long process for the most part. And if you can't hold a public meeting within 30 days, well, I think that people will get word of it and they'll be clamoring for an opportunity to talk about it. And BOCC Tuesday afternoon meetings are going to be filled with people again. Commissioner Pestinger?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with Commissioner Day, and I think that that's the number one reason we've seen so few applicants for this.
Yeah. Commissioner Day, did you have more?
Yeah, I think I agree with Commissioner Casino, and I wonder if there's a way to think about having one of those public meeting opportunities be a standing meeting. Like maybe it has to come up at the Tuesday meeting that so there is some opportunity. I feel like if we don't find a way to include the public, they're gonna oppose it.
yeah.
And I think, again,
And again, it's a requirement, and it won't necessarily be waived by anybody. the director will consult with stakeholders and the Board of County Commissioners before the director makes a decision on whether to waive that requirement. So it's not automatically waived. It has to be requested and it has to be approved as a waived requirement.
And then to follow up on that, I had a question about that. So if the Board of County Commissioners disagreed with the director's waivers, what kind of recourse do they have? I mean, would they have to
Fire
pass
the
an
director, I
ordinance?
suppose, no.
And I mean, is
I mean,
that, is it that drastic as far as?
Is there anything in between?
I
Yeah.
believe that they would work it out. They would find some kind of consensus or agreement. That we can't regulate their relationships.
Right, so it's a consultation with the Board of County Commissioners. If the Board of County Commissioners are directing the director, that is their purview. And there are HR requirements if the director does not move forward in the fashion that he or she has been directed. So I don't know if that's really an issue.
Well, to kind of harken back a little bit, if the intention is for the director to consult with stakeholders and the BOCC, I've tried to have stuff brought before the BOCC before, and an AIS is a long process and a work session is hard to get, which again to me says there's lots of time to have a public meeting. So no reason to waive a public meeting, public informational meeting.
Could it even be an online meeting?
Maybe, I mean, they've done that kind of stuff before.
It does address that in there. It can be a virtual meeting.
I know
If
when,
it's a virtual meeting, that has to be pretty easy to, relatively easy to notice and set up.
yeah, I mean, I really like that when they were considering the 710 Carpenter Road. We actually had a commissioner show up there with a little pup tent and took questions from people. And I think that was fantastic. I think that's the kind of engagement government should have with local communities, and it's something that can impact them this large.
Right, and if I could just chime in, sorry, it might be a little bit hard to chime in from the virtual world, but these are not decisions that the Planning Commission needs to make tonight. What we could do is have a public hearing, and then if the Planning Commission wishes to remove the waiver on public informational meetings, we can certainly include that in a recommendation and draft an ordinance with that included that goes to the board for consideration. But what I would suggest is allowing the public to comment and hearing what they have to say and what their concerns are as well. So
I think that's really reasonable. Unless somebody has anything else, we should probably consider a motion. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
It seems like homeless issue is in a crisis or emergency situation all the time. So what constitutes a crisis or emergency where this permit would come into?
Well, the Board of Health put out a resolution in 2018 with a long list of findings that has a lot of data in it, and that was included in the packet as well, in the memo. And it had not all of the data, but I selected some of the more.
Are there specific metrics that would mark the end of a crisis?
Just the Board of Health's decision, not as far as I know.
I looked at that resolution or whatever you call it, and it did not have those metrics. I think that's a real sticking point.
Yeah.
I think for getting this accepted, it would really help to at least think about putting some metrics around that, like if you're gonna give this power to waive all these things during the crisis, you have all these rules, but you're gonna waive them selectively. I think for some people, that's a real sticking point. They'd like to know, okay, what are the metrics around that when you just, especially if it's actually endemic and it's going to be part of our lives for a long time. I think a question in people's minds is, isn't this really just changing the rules altogether? Because this is an endemic problem, not really a crisis in the sense of something that's going to resolve. It's so endemic, we can't see an end to it. And so that's just something to think about. It may help it move through a little easier if there's some help with that.
Does anybody else have anything on this particular item?
Yeah, and we'll go back to the waivers. I think at least the language right now just allows the director to waive the number of residents allowed. There's no,
Yeah.
I think we need to say, you know, maybe it's 50%.
Oh, you want to put a limit on that?
You
Okay.
know, a 50% addition to what's allowed, or whatever we come up with, but I think there needs to be a number, because I mean, as I said at the last meeting, I have a real problem with just handing this to somebody and saying, well, you know, if you want to waive it, go for it.
I think the decision on that could be very site specific, and maybe there's a huge site. Maybe, you know, and just saying, well, we allow 40, but you can go up to 60, but maybe it's a 10-acre site. I mean, we don't really know. Every case, every application that comes in is so unique, and the situation.
Maybe the waiver can be to an upper limit, but with a public
Yeah.
hearing or something else, then,
Or even if
or BOCC.
I mean, we have zoning regulations. We could say you can only have, you know, so many people per acre, or so many, whatever it is, tents
Like
or
cattle.
trailers or whatever.
Right.
But I mean, because, I mean, 40 people, especially when we're talking about urban growth area, we're talking about lots.
Mhm.
There's not very many 10-acre lots in the urban growth
Right.
area anymore.
But there are in the rural county, and there are people in the rural county who would love to help the homeless community. I've heard from them.
Yeah.
You can hear.
Well, I think that, I personally think that we should move forward to gather some public comment, and the best way to do that is through public hearing, and then we will certainly be working on this more after the public hearing. So if anybody would care to make a motion regarding that, I would appreciate it.
That's on slide 10,
Okay,
and I think you all have that copy.
I move to set a public hearing on development code docket item A24, emergency housing ordinance code amendment for Wednesday, August 17th at 7 p.m. or soon thereafter, as the matter may be heard.
it's been moved and seconded. It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? Okay, it's been moved to set.
I have a comment.
Go ahead, Kevin.
So I'm in favor and will support this motion, but I would have preferred that we had a better product to present to the public. I agree with Commissioner Day's comments, and I think there's a number of things we brought up for consideration that could have been incorporated before that we could get public comment and feedback on a better version. And I wish we were doing that, but I'm still, in the interest of expediting this, willing to support this motion.
Thank you. Go ahead.
And I just have a real quick comment. I think it would be real helpful for the hearing. You know, there's a section here where it talks about, let's see, I was gonna try to be quick. You know, what are the barriers to applying? And it gives a couple of examples of barriers, and it says the expense, the initial and ongoing expense, and then finding an appropriate site. But we've had a lot of discussion about other barriers, and I think it would be helpful to make that a little bit more robust for the public hearing to talk about what you really perceive to be the barriers that need to be overcome and how this can help with that.
Can you give me a couple of examples?
Well, I mean, Derek gave one, just the drugs issue, or, I mean, we've discussed a number of things. It's just that here, the only things talked about are the expenses and finding a site, and that doesn't seem really like maybe that's where
Well, that's the information that we got directly from PHSS after they
Yeah.
applied last year, that they said those were the two biggest barriers that they faced. So, yeah, we could add
Well,
something.
and I would argue that the drug thing is a barrier to getting people in the county.
Yes.
Not a barrier to actually getting it.
Yeah, okay,
So,
well, we
I
heard
mean,
about-
and that's something I think we need to think about.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we do have a motion on the floor, and the motion is to move to set a public hearing on development code docket item A24, the emergency housing ordinance code amendment for Wednesday, August 17th, 2022 at 7 p.m. or soon thereafter, as the matter may be heard. Call for the vote.
Commissioner Day?
Aye.
Commissioner Halverson?
Aye.
Commissioner Hanson?
Aye.
Commissioner Carmen?
Aye.
Commissioner Nelson?
Aye.
Commissioner Pessinger?
Aye.
Commissioner Simmons.
Aye.
Commissioner Wheatley.
Aye.
Commissioner Casino.
Aye. Motion passes. Thank you very much for setting that public hearing.
Thank you, Commissioner.
All right, next up on our list is a work session on the Shoreline Master Program with Andre DeFovas.
Meeting commissioners, go ahead and pull up the SMP and so we get to the right spot and then. Try not to.
May I ask a question on 500?
Yeah. Andy, we're gonna start, Commissioner Wheatley wanted to back up to 500 real quick for one before we move into finishing 600. Is that all right?
Did you want to present or something, or were we just gonna?
I don't,
go
I have
right
very
into it?
brief opening remarks, just to
Okay,
say
do
that,
those,
just to
yeah.
say that we're here tonight to continue to have planning commission discuss the SMP draft recommendation, provide feedback, shape your recommendation to the board. I was planning to begin where we left off in chapter 600 with the agricultural development standards and then continue moving forward. And I will have some comments on that, but happy to let you ask your questions.
Yeah, so it was on, just an overall question. There's the Thurston County Shoreline Inventory and Characterization Report.
2013.
Yeah, from 2013, and I forget, I didn't make a note of where that was exactly referenced in the 500 section, but my question was, that's supposedly on an 8 or maybe now a 10-year cycle, because I assume it's connected to the GMA somehow. And so my question is the county working on an update to that now? Because it seems like it's due if it was 2013. And then is that something that we can hear about, in relation to all of this?
Yep, so the inventory and characterization is part of the foundational work that jurisdictions do when they embark upon a comprehensive shoreline master program update. Thurston County, that work was completed back in 2013. And it forms the basis of all the regulations that come after that. So all the shoreline environment designations, the goals, the policies, the regulations of the SMP, all those pieces. And so every 8 to 10 years, depending on exactly what the law says, that's the update period for the actual shoreline master program and the periodic updates. My understanding is that when those updates come due, the inventory and characterization is not required to be redone. And in talking with ecology, it's been a long time ago now, but I had that same sort of question because that, we're in 2022 and we're talking about a document that's from 2013, but they indicated to me that, jurisdictions that even completed their SMPs back then, when they're doing their periodic updates, now they're not revisiting that information. What the SMP will do though, so if this gets adopted and approved and implemented in 2023, that will set the baseline for the no net loss piece. So 8 years, whenever our next periodic update comes due, it's written into the SMP draft that at that time we are to look at there's metrics in the SMP that we're tracking as time goes on once we implement it to be able to comment on, is this document actually achieving no net loss? Is there a need to adaptively manage how we're tracking this or what the SMP requires to get at that no net loss requirement? So we'll have to do that assessment down the line, but it will not involve a fresh inventory and characterization. One caveat to all of that is that because it's been so long since the inventory characterization was done, there have since been changes in the data that we have on our shorelines, and we've actually had some stream segments fall out of the SMP because they're not quite at 20 cubic feet per second. We've had a couple lakes come into the SMP because we've realized, oh wow, they are actually over 20 acres. We've had annexations or things like that have changed what actually is a jurisdictional shoreline. And so to the extent that there are some new shorelines that are now in the draft in 2022, there has been inventory and characterization information developed for those, and shoreline environment designations applied to those, and that information has been captured in supplements to those 2013 documents.
So is there no grounds for determining whether there's been net loss over the last 10 years then, really? I mean, officially, other than maybe the stream basin surveys that the TRPC does?
I think my understanding is that the requirement to the baseline for the no net loss is the effective date of the SMP. So in a perfect world, the inventory characterization information and the effective date of the SMP would have been much closer together. But that's something that I thought originally was that the inventory characterization was our baseline. It is not. It is the effective date of the SMP. So when that SMP is adopted, that's where that begins. The longer we have until the SMP is adopted, the longer any of its protections are not getting a net loss.
No, I just got a comment to that, because what you did is you made a great point. 2013, there's been a lot of changes to that inventory and characterization report since 2013, and I've noted several of those in writing to the Planning Commission and Danner specifically. Not just the habitat around the lake, the number of docks, the barriers and the walls, but the fish that are in the lake that aren't there, that are in the characterization report, that just physically aren't there, but yet they're in there. And planning department is actually using that document for permits. Okay, so there's a lot of updates that need to be done to that.
So it only gets worse the longer we wait.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that will be addressed in the supplement.
Thank you,
Yes.
All right, on to 600. One
Which
more.
leads to another comment. I would like to suggest a work session or two devoted strictly to this to move it along faster.
Oh, I think we're gonna move this along quick.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
We all agree with that.
I'm ready if you are.
Yep.
Okay, great. So staff had sent a memo. So let me back this up. We're going to look at chapter 19,600, which are the development standards for shoreline uses and modifications. Specifically, we'll start in agriculture. That's where we left off last time. I am working on the document that you're seeing up here on the screen. I've gone ahead and made the changes that the Planning Commission has requested in the time since the May 18th draft was put up. Technically, what we're looking at here is a document dated July 19th. Once we get through this agriculture piece, I can republish that and everything. But just wanted to let you know that the changes that have been requested over the last 3 work sessions have been addressed in the document. Okay, so I had sent a memo ahead of the July 6th Planning Commission meeting looking at 2 areas of the agriculture development standards that the public had commented on, that the Planning Commission had discussion of, but that were not quite baked by the time we got to the May 18th document. And so at the last Planning Commission meeting, there was some discussion about additional text in the agriculture section that hadn't been modified prior to the hearing, but conversation ensued about that. We do want to focus tonight on the areas, remaining items that we need Planning Commission feedback on, things that have changed since the hearing. However, I do also have some information from since the last meeting, and I can show some options, specifically the fertilizer and spraying of that. I've got some information to share on that. So let me go ahead and scroll down.
I have a question, if it's okay.
Yeah.
So Andrew, I just passed my 1-year anniversary here on this, and I've attended a lot of these meetings about the Shoreline Master Plan. And previously, I heard a lot of agenda, like future agenda, that we're going to get to aquaculture soon, and yet I haven't yet seen us get to aquaculture. And it seems like we're running out of stuff we're covering here. Is aquaculture still on the agenda for the future?
So there is no specific conversation about aquaculture scheduled. However, the development standards for aquaculture are in this same chapter. So if we get through agriculture tonight, that would be the very next section. And I'm just going to kind of go through section by section and ask for questions and comments on each one as we go.
Yeah, and
Perfect. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and just to remember our sideboards, from, public hearing forward is what we're worried about.
Okay, so this is the document as it went to public hearing. But I do have, so options down here in the text. And so there's kind of two focus areas. One, again, was how the draft looks at reduction of buffers for agriculture. Public commented about that. So staff went back and took a look to try to make it clear where and how buffers could be reduced for agriculture, and then talk to ecology about that. And one of the things that we came up with was that making it clear that buffers can be reduced the same way they can for other uses, and that if you are seeking the buffer and you have a approved farm management plan, you could do so without a shoreline variance. Previously, the draft did require a variance, and it does require a shoreline variance for other uses that are trying to reduce their buffer. But the proposal would be to not require a shoreline variance if there is a farm plan developed with USDA standards. Ecology supports that approach.
Okay.
The second piece is, I'm gonna jump around a bit. The other issue the public has commented on, the Planning Commission has looked at, is how the draft looks at agricultural operations that go dormant, and whether we would ever look at those as abandoned uses, i.e. when they come back and want to resume that agriculture, would we consider it new ag or not? The difference being, if it is new ag, it would be subject to the requirements of the new SMP. If it is existing and ongoing ag, it would not be. And so I've talked that through with ecology, and they do support use of the words or dormant as the Planning Commission requested. So this is kind of more of a report back to Planning Commission. This is what was suggested. Run it to ground. There's support for this because there are actually provisions in state law that support this as well. And my understanding is they are intended to be interpreted broadly. So potentially that will suit the requests of the Planning Commission. The third item, which this goes back to last meeting. So there were comments here about there was a prohibition of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides unless the applicant can demonstrate the application would not result in runoff to contaminated or runoff of contaminated waters into shoreline water bodies. The concern being, who is going to, how are they going to demonstrate that? Who at the county is going to have the knowledge to look at that? And so I did talk to ecology about this, and they suggested, Tess Brandon, who's our contact there, suggested some alternate language that sort of gets at the same thing and makes it clear that this is still a requirement. It is still a requirement that application of chemicals, is not allowed to result in contaminated shoreline water bodies. And it's the responsibility of the operator to determine whether or not that is occurring. Whether or not we have it in here as a prohibition or that demonstration is required, we reserve the ability to request that during the application process. But this is an attempt to frame this in a different way to respond directly to the last Planning Commission meeting. So I'm going to pause there. There are those three policy areas within the ag section, and see what the Planning Commission would like to.
Scott, did you like that one, Scott?
Yeah. No, I think that works.
Okay, sure. And also I should add, this whole section here, the only things that have changed since the only language that is new is what's highlighted, shall not require shoreline variance. And then all the rest of this was just rearranging it. We rearranged it for clarity because it jumped right into buffer reductions instead of laying out general requirements. So there was just an overall attempt to make this whole section function better.
So you took the stuff that's in the 2 paragraph and moved it down?
Yeah, all of this language is still in this document. It's just rearranged for better flow. Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was always here, all this stuff here about, it was already there. Yeah, we've moved that. The change has been, we're clarifying that you don't have to have a shoreline variance to achieve a reduced buffer if you have an approved farm
I like the change.
Yeah. All right.
I don't agree with the reduction of the buffer, but that's a whole other issue.
Well, this is essentially saying agriculture can have its buffers reduced the same way that any other use can. And so in the chapter 19-400, it goes into the conditions by which a buffer could be administratively reduced. And we're just clarifying that ag is the same as other uses. The only policy change that has been introduced here as an option would be to waive the variance requirement.
But in the version I have in my hand, it's not underlined there, but it's underlined here. Buffers may be reduced as provided for in 19.400(120)B, which
Yes.
is where, I have some heartburn with.
So,
Harvard
yeah, and-
General on 400.
Right,
Yeah,
yes, and
so
that,
this looks as if that were not new language, but it actually is, right? It should be underlined, I think.
I may have missed that. So, but again, so this is just whether this sentence is in here or
Yeah,
not.
right.
Those buffer reduction provisions are still in the document. It was just making it clear because we had people commenting that, we should be able to reduce the buffers for agriculture. We're trying to make it clear that you can. And there's, yeah. So, and if I missed that, and the intent is that I would just replace what's above with what's below here and, make it less marked up again. But yeah, if I missed that, I apologize.
Right there.
Oh, yes, so yeah, okay, I see what you're saying.
You just didn't underline it.
Yeah,
Yeah, that should be
okay, I just missed that, okay. So, okay, are there questions, other comments about any of what's proposed as these policy points? Otherwise, I will move forward.
Right, let's move forward.
Okay, so now we are getting into aquaculture. So again, if anyone, Planning Commission has questions, comments about language that has changed since the public hearing, please let me know, and I'm happy to lead that discussion or facilitate that discussion rather, and try to explain why it looks the way it does.
Go ahead.
After 2, the third bullet should be, I think, aquatic. Colon, adjoining upland designation applies. And then you go into geoduck aquaculture and all designations. That just follows your charts on page 98.
So this is, well, if most aquaculture is going to be, it's going to be in the aquatic SED because it's below the water, ordinary high water mark. And we're saying that we apply the same SED as is applied on the upland. That number 3 there is specifically, that's in response to state law. So,
Right.
we county have the ability to set permit requirements, except where we're preempted by state law, and this is one of those areas, so.
But on page 98 on your chart, under aquaculture, you specifically put aquatic. You say adjoining upland designations apply, but it's not in the written paragraph.
I see, okay. Okay.
It's just an insert to flow with your chart.
Sure, okay, I can do that, yeah. All right, let me make that's easy. Okay,
I mean, my concern is if you leave it out in the narrative, it's in the chart, people get confused when they go back and forth.
sure.
Good, Commissioner Wheelie.
Oh, just a quick, sort of along the same lines, just a little, I think in B, where you refer to section 19.500.105C, I think it might now be 100C, maybe?
It may be, yeah, there's, okay. I can check that. One thing I noticed in making changes after the public hearing, sections and numbers kind of jump around depending on if you're adding or omitting language. So I'm gonna have to do a scrub at the end of the process to make sure they're all correct. Okay, I will make that, check on that. Okay, who else has questions, comments on the aquaculture section?
One more, Commissioner Wheelie.
Yeah, I'll skip over that one, but on C1, I would like to see, well, I don't know if this is possible at this point, but I would like to see something added about, you have proposed residential subdivisions and other land uses and developments B, which may impact ag operations shall provide facilities to prevent adverse water quality impacts. So there's some thinking about the impact of residential subdivisions on aquaculture, but there's not a kind of a similar thinking about the impact of aquaculture on other uses. And I would like to see something about that, like compatibility with existing use, perhaps, some kind of a, what I wrote was would like to see compatibility with existing use, recreation, and public access prioritized, especially for natural, urban, and shoreline residential areas. So, I was encouraged to think about that by the new 2022 NetPen guidelines, where they talk about what local jurisdictions can and cannot sort of think about, and compatible use and adverse impacts is something that we can think about. And that's where you would put it, is in the development standards, it seems like.
And I would point out a couple things. One is that the state only considers aquaculture to be a preferred use of the shoreline when it's consistent with control of pollution and impacts to the ecological function. So there is a requirement to demonstrate that it's doing so. I want to point out letter G here, right, which is in the development standards. I don't know if you saw that one, but that's discussing, there needs to be adequate review of these sites, and they're going to have to demonstrate that, it's not resulting in a loss of ecological function, or where there are going to be adverse impacts to habitat that cannot be mitigated. So there's already that piece in here.
Yeah, I'm talking about other elements, though. I'm talking about like recreation.
Yeah. There is a requirement that it doesn't conflict with navigation or water dependent uses. We could potentially look at.
Well, it's preferred use. Aquaculture is going to take priority over just about everything. And I think we still have to remember that aquaculture might be the most regulated industry on the shorelines when it comes to ecology, Army Corps of Engineers, and everything else. I'm not terribly concerned with it, and I'm also concerned that we're kind of backing up for the public hearing. So
okay,
and that I could potentially, because I don't remember what it all says on the spot, I could look at it a little closer and see if there is if there's anything else in here that might address those concerns already, and report back.
All right. Okay, well, I have one on G, but if somebody has something before that.
I have some comments.
go ahead, Commissioner Pestinger.
So unfortunately, I can't see all of the changes right in front of me right now, but I know there was a large amount of public comment that related to aquaculture along multiple different topic lines, one of which was plastification, one of which was use of the pesticides that have killed burrowing shrimp, one of which was along the lines of mussel rafts, pens. I was just out a couple months ago at Steamboat Island at low tide and saw a fairly large number of abandoned mussel raft pens that were pretty high up on the shoreline. I was surprised to see them, and I would have thought they would have been removed. But I just wonder, Andrew, if you can say about any changes that you made to this based off of those types of public comments?
I don't know that there were significant changes made to this section based on those.
I have some specific suggestions along those lines.
I don't know that a lot of those there have been a lot of changes to this. Yeah, I mean, aquaculture is going to be regulated by any number of agencies that are all looking at their different piece of it. But no, I'm not aware that there were significant changes made.
And I think it should be noted that it is unlawful to abandon aquaculture gear. Like,
yeah,
every agency and their dog does not like abandoned gear.
Right. And this document specifically requires that abandoned gear be removed and all those sorts of things, and not stored.
It's right here in B.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Commissioner Wheatley.
Well, for G in that same general standards, I'd like to see G moved to be the first thing that you see under general standards. That aquaculture should not be permitted in areas where it would result in a net loss of shoreline ecological functions. And then I'd also like to see some language added to that, and the language is specifically from RCW 173.26.241 3BIC. Aquaculture should not be permitted in areas where it would result in a net loss of ecological functions, adversely impact eelgrass and microalgae, or significantly conflict with navigation or other water dependent uses. Aquacultural facilities should be designed and located so as not to spread disease to native aquatic life. Establish new non-native species which cause significant ecological impacts or significantly impact the aesthetic qualities of the shoreline. Now, I realize that's already in the RCW, but I think it's really useful
I
to
think
have
that's,
it.
that's a, not to be pedantic here, but
Yeah.
post public hearing. I want to focus just on post public.
And I think a lot of that stuff is in there, it's just not
Yeah.
in one, it's several different, because H is the water dependent uses one. The navigation, aquaculture shall not significantly conflict with navigation and other water dependent uses.
Well, this is in the RCW that is concerning aquaculture.
Yes. Chair Casino, I don't understand what you keep talking about with the post-public hearing. There were a lot of public comments about no net loss related to aquaculture.
We're just discussing changes that have been made to the draft after the public hearing
And
update.
I would add that post-public hearing, we went through the draft and the planning commission was forwarded public comment, and there were several work sessions where staff asked for the scope of public comment that planning commission wished to address in the draft, and this is now the product of that work.
I disagree with that. I think it was requested for this to be part of that.
Well, can I ask another question then?
Mm-hmm.
Just about what is pre and post, section 3, the whole net pen section is.
I'm sorry, can I go back? I want that, I would like that recorded for the record, that I disagree with staff that this was discussed and requested to be included in this.
Noted.
So noted.
Thank you.
So can you sort of explain to me what happened to this whole net pen section? Is that something we can or can't talk about this evening?
We can. So this was a discussion that planning commission had post-public hearing. This language is not, language for net pens is not necessarily a requirement in the master program. All of the general requirements for aquaculture would apply no matter what type of operation you're doing. And so at the request of planning commission, staff deleted this section.
At the request of the planning commission. So this is something where, I'd like to request that it be put back and clarified that it applies also to mussel rafts if it does, or what does apply to mussel rafts?
So we had, and I could forward, I'm not trying to remember my chronology. I think probably it was before you joined the planning commission. We had a couple work sessions where we specifically talked about aquacultures and the mussel rafts, because that was, when we were looking at this section and conversations with ecology, the comments were, well, Thurston County doesn't have net pens, but you do have mussel rafts. And so I went and looked at permits that the county has issued. There's only one that I'm familiar with out in Totten Inlet, and looked at the permit conditions that were on that permit, and brought this before planning commission to see whether there was interest in developing those into development standards. That was actually one of the options that went to public hearing, was to include that information or not. And so post-public hearing, discussing this draft with planning commission, they elected the option to remove that, which I think was before you joined the planning commission. But yeah.
Okay, this is going into the minority report, nothing else.
Please do. Yeah, keep good notes for what you want to go in there.
But I can definitely send you some of the memos on that. And if you have questions, you can definitely let me know. Okay. All right, is there anything else in the aquaculture section? Are there any questions, comments on section 19,600-120, barrier structures and in-stream structures?
Just the same comment. We look about natural shoreline urban SDPs, that aquatic is missing from 120, 125, 135.
Thank you. So 120, 125.
And 135.
Okay. I could look at that, just kind of, globally and make sure that
Just
it's
a
where it
matter
needs
for
to be.
consistency.
Sure.
And to keep, because in every other section, it's there.
Okay. Okay. Anything else on 120?
Was this just another quick question about history, I guess?
Sure.
Because I read your memo from a year ago. And there were questions about fencing going down to like the water line and so forth. Is that stuff that was discussed and decided on already?
Yeah, we discussed all of
That
the
might have been
structures.
pre public hearing. It might have been, I'd have to go back and look.
Because there were questions that you posed about that.
I think that happened, I think that was in preparation for the public hearing. I'm pretty sure it got in there, but I would have to double check. If it is not underlined in this document, it should be something that was gelled by the public hearing draft. Okay, how about section 19,600-125, voting facilities?
Go ahead.
I've been working hard on this.
No, I appreciate it too.
Yeah, the shift from 5 or more boats to 5 or more single-family residences seems pretty significant to me. And I don't know if this, how this is in response to public hearings. I mean, maybe you can explain that, because my personal feeling is I would like to see it restored back to 5 or more boats. And if there's, some heartache about kayaks or something, there could be language about that, about personal watercraft.
So that was actually pointed out by the public, that it's inconsistent with what the WAC requires. That was actually an error in the document. Boating facilities are intended to apply to 5 or more residences per the WAC. And this did not say that before, so we made that correction.
Is there a reason it's only single-family residences?
I'd have to look and see if that's how the WAC is written or not, but
Okay.
yeah, whether versus 5 dwelling units
Exactly.
that are, yeah. I could look at that to potentially clarify.
And then another thing about that was is it prohibited in natural areas still? I wasn't too clear about that. Like,
It's just natural prohibited.
Yeah.
Okay.
As written,
All
yes.
That's why I think putting the other one in there like aquatic is important, because it goes back to page 98 and it says specifically there what it applies to.
Well, and so Commissioner Halverson, I would point out in any of these sections, there is a sentence here that talks about, if you're proposing it in the adjacent aquatic area, which if it's a dock, it would be, the corresponding upland designation applies. So obviously it's in the water, but this is saying, even if you're in the water, if the shoreline itself is natural, you're not allowed to have that boating facility in that water.
I understand that,
Yeah.
natural,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, and that's kind of a catch-all throughout the document, but I will still go back and make that check for you. Okay, anything else in 125 voting facilities? Start scrolling. All right, so 130 is commercial development. Any questions, comments on any changes made to this section? Well, keep going then. Section 135, which is dredging and dredge disposal.
Andrew, you'll need to correct the numbering for that section.
For the letter A here.
Yeah, the letters and the numbers, and you got A, and then you got dredging under it should be,
Yeah.
and then A and B and
That should,
so forth. You'll catch that.
yeah, it should probably be 1 dredging and then A, B, C, D, 2 dredge disposal. Okay, thank you. I'll make that change. Yeah, formatting. Okay. Great. So how about 140, which is fill? Yes.
I see here, I don't know if you could explain, or maybe it's just an error. There's a, under natural, or sorry, A1A says, for any use except restoration. And then in A2A, it says except ecological restoration. Is that an intended difference?
Probably not. I will look at that, make sure, but yeah. Thank you.
1B there is cup for landward of the OHVM. I think terminology previously used is upland of the OHVM.
Okay.
And same in 2B, SDP for fill upland of the OHVM.
One sec.
It would be just to be consistent with wording out in the rest.
Okay, so I'm sorry, tell me where you were again?
1B, A1B says landward.
Yeah.
Upland is the term we've used in the previous ones.
Okay.
And same with 2B.
Mm-hmm.
Bill landward, uplands the terminology we've used previously.
So I will add that to my list of just kind of global things to do, which I have an update for you on the lakes and streams later that I completed. So, okay, great. I'll do that for you. Okay. So how about anything then in section 145, forest practices / timber harvest? If not, section 150 would be industrial development.
Yeah, I had something on that, for rural, okay, so, and this is partly me trying to get up to speed again. On the, as I understand it, the thinking here was that, I think in the old memo, the year-old memo, it said, you know, that this is partly coming out of conversations with ecology, that, that there was some sense of wanting to shift industrial development from shoreline, from shoreline residential and sort of urban to rural conservancy, just, and I'm not sure what the reasoning of all of that was, but as it shifts to rural conservancy, it kind of comes up against the fact that rural industry is supposed to be directly connected to rural resources, that you're not, you know, there are limits to the kind of industry that should happen in rural areas. And so it seems like somehow that should be carried over into the SMP, that that like something like only rural industry related or water-based industry should be allowed. You know, some kind of specifying, I mean, if it's going to shift over to rural, but then you don't change the nature of the industry to fit rural industry, that seems like a bit of a problem.
So when I set out to work on this, and based on ecology comments and we're talking with planning commission, the intent was to try to align where the industrial uses would be allowed in the shoreline with what the shoreline designation descriptions were from the WAC, which ours are of course based on. And that's where we looked at and saw, well, shoreline residential, there's zero mention of industry being a preferred or a good use of that area or anything like that. But Rural Conservancy actually does talk about commercial and industrial uses with caveats and with limitations. And so those are reflected in the document here. I would point you to, let's see. This is non-water oriented. So we're basically saying you need to be water oriented industry. Otherwise, there's very limited instances where you would be able to locate here. It would have to be something designated for industrial use in the comp plan, physically separated from the shoreline, kind of in the isolated buffers that we've talked about in the past. Otherwise, these other standards apply everywhere. So we're looking at, this is basically saying low intensity water oriented use can be permitted where they've been in the past and where there are services to support the use. So it's pretty limited.
So with that caveat of sort of on the other side of the road thing, so then the rural designation, the rural industry designation would apply at that point then?
Yeah,
Is that a given or?
And that's kind of global. That's just so everyone knows globally. If you have an area that is otherwise in shoreline jurisdiction, but you have a logical reason to call that area out because of a functional break from the shoreline water body, it wouldn't necessarily be subject to the same rules as something that's closer. And this is in that same concept.
Well, and I think for industrial development, you're gonna have to be zoned for it too.
That's correct. Absolutely.
And I think Rural Conservancy kind of covers everything that's not something else. It's basically Thurston County, unless you've got a bunch of houses or something that's natural.
That's effectively how the work was done. That's what's described in the SED report is, if it matched the most dense shorelines, it was shoreline residential. If it was pristine, it was natural. And the urban and rural conservancy were that's why that's the vast majority of what our shorelines are.
And just to follow up on that, Thurston County decided not even to have an industrial designation for the shoreline when that was an option, right? But we decided.
Right.
Like we got rid of mining.
Yeah.
We got rid of the County Planning Commission, we got rid of the mining designation in the SMP. Also, yes, so the cities and other counties that are perhaps more urban can have there is a high intensity designation in the ecology menu, and this SMP does not include that.
Yeah.
Because we don't have shorelines that match that description. The port is in the city of Olympia, so they've got urban waterfront or whatever that would be. So, okay. Anything else in that section? Otherwise, we'll move on to 19-600-155 mining. Don't recall any changes in this section. Okay, great. So I will move on to 19-600-160 mooring structures and activities. Everything in this section.
No, I like that. It's a CUP for.
And yeah, that's based on changes planning commission has requested.
So again, is this one where these things were decided a long time ago and I can't bring them up again? I don't like that.
Well, you go to the minority report, I think.
Okay.
Well, this one specifically, I think was post hearing.
There have been some changes,
Which would be to allow with a cup to allow single use in joint public use stocks in the natural area.
And that was something that went to public hearing and we did, and that was up for comment of the public and state agencies and anyone who wanted to comment. Planning commission elected to allow that with a conditional use.
Yeah.
Okay. If there's nothing else, I will move on. 165. Oh, yeah, I did, I took out all the specific stuff and tied it back to the HPA. That's a big change, but hooray, that is much less text for our folks. Okay. section 165, which is recreational development.
Okay, so here's what I want to do. You can tell me if we can talk about it or not. I would like to see the public access returned to this.
So the public access, there is a public access requirement for shoreline master programs. There's certain uses that go in the shoreline that where public access is required. And then there's other recreational development that can occur in the shoreline, absent that component. This previous version of this draft, one of the issues that ecology had with it, and one of the things that they commented on was those issues were inflated. That, and the requirements in this draft were not necessarily meeting what was in the WAC. And so I don't think that anything has been really deleted or has gone away. It is potentially just moved over to the public access section, which is in 19,400. So specifically, shoreline uses and modifications that require, where public access is required, that's going to be addressed in 19,400. That's in the general regulations of the SMP. This is capturing other recreational development. So you'll notice through here, yes, references to public access are struck out, but all the standards for when public access is required are in 19,400. Realistically, though, I mean, if you're proposing some sort of recreational development because it's a required public access piece, you're going to have to meet both sections anyway. But this is an attempt to separate these two concepts because they are separate concepts when it comes to shoreline planning.
Well, I did notice in the handbook that it said, for example, that development actually, increases demand. And so if you're going to talk about recreational development, you might want to address that in this section that public access has to be addressed when those kinds of changes occur. And there can be blockages to traditional access and that kind of thing. So there's still a public access element that could come up under recreational development. So I still think you might want to keep the and public access.
I'd have to look specifically about how we address that concept, because you're right, if there is some sort of historic access and there's new development and that access is taken away, potentially there is a requirement to restore some form of public access. There could be. So I think the way we attempted to address that here was to kind of tie those pieces together and saying, if you're required to do public access based on the SMA or this master program, you would be subject to those other rules, but they are two distinct concepts.
Well, you specifically say that when recreational development is part of public access required for this program or the Shoreline Management Act, development shall also be subject to section 19,400.
Right.
What is part of the, when recreational development is part of public access.
It should probably say when recreational development is proposed due to public access required by this program or something like that. So, it's meant to, if it's tied to, if it's a requirement, that's what that's intended to be. So it may not be the most clear, but anything.
What if we changed as part of to includes?
Yeah. That could work. Would that address that
It
concern?
would be better than part of.
Okay.
Yeah. And maybe, because you do reference, since you do reference 19,445 there.
Concept is there. You're here to help me get the words exactly right. So perfect. Any other comments on 19,600-165?
A subparagraph 3. Going back to your uses and modifications chart, page 100. Under aquatic, it should be included non-water oriented prohibited.
Okay.
It's specifically addressed in the use and modification.
Let me make a note of that. So essentially the description in A3 does not match what you see in the table.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. If there's nothing else in that section, I might wrap there in the interest of your agenda and time. I would like to close by just giving you brief updates. So things that I did since the last meeting, I looked at the description of exemptions to substantial development permits. There was a question about whether a lot of references to state laws and state permits, but not federal. I did run that to ground and I talked to ecology, and there should not be anything in those regulations that prohibit the federal agencies from taking advantage of that. So they should, if they are proposing a project that is restoration, it still needs to meet those state requirements as well. So any project sponsor should be able to take advantage of that SDP exemption. One clarification would be if it's a federal project on federal land, the SMP would not apply anyway. The cost threshold exemption for docks, there was a comment that what's in the SMP does not match what is currently the best guidance from ecology. So I did go back and look at that, and actually the WAC has not been updated since that cost threshold was changed. So I did go ahead and update the SMP to use the most current dollar values. And I also updated the preamble to that section that talks about all the exemptions and say it's this RCW that controls, as amended. So anytime there's a change to the RCW, the SMP will change and follow suit, because that would be true whether we clarify that or not. Okay, and then I've made several changes since the last couple meetings, rephrasing things for clarity that you've asked for, fixing references to the size of lakes and streams to be consistent throughout, and it's now consistent that shoreline jurisdiction is streams over 20 CFS and it's lakes 20 acres and above. So you can be a 20-acre lake and be SMP, you cannot be a 20 CFS stream and be in the SMP, that'd be 20.01. And so those sorts of things have been changes, tweaks, and small errors addressed as best to my ability. And that concludes what I have for you this evening.
Thank you, Andrew. All right, we're going to move forward. We're running long tonight. How about some staff updates? No staff updates. All right, how about let's go through our calendar. On August 3rd, we are tentatively looking at the Shoreline Master Program, the wireless code update, start on the Ag CAO, and more on the emergency housing ordinance. Is there anybody that does not believe they will be able to attend August 3rd? Okay, it looks like everyone should be here. On August 17th, we'll be looking at the capital improvement program, boundary line adjustment code amendments, emergency housing ordinance, and update forest conservation ordinance tentatively. Is there anybody that doesn't believe they can make the August 17th meeting? Looks like we should.
I may not be able to attend.
Okay, Joel is a maybe. Okay, with that, we're going to move on to the good of the order. We're going to start off with Commissioner Wheatley and her topic.
Just really briefly, when I did the learning experience of doing a minority report, I signed, Joel said he would sign on to it.
Yeah.
But he didn't vote. And so he was taken off. But I went back and looked at the stuff about transmittal of reports to the Board of County Commissioners. And it
Rules and
doesn't,
procedure.
yeah, in rules and procedures, and it doesn't say that you have to have voted in order to be able to sign.
I don't believe you do. I believe you either sign the minority report or you don't. It has nothing to do with how you vote.
Okay, so I was told that he had to be taken off.
Does he have to be
because he
taken
hadn't
off?
voted.
He abstained from voting altogether.
So he
Right,
can't be
but
part of the
he-
minority
He
report?
can still put his name on the minority report though.
It says any commissioner may.
Yeah, so
No.
he would like, I would
Yeah.
like to put his name back on because I took it off because I was told he couldn't have his name.
I'll go
on.
back and look at the Robert's Rules
If
of
you,
Order.
if you could, yeah.
Well,
From what I remember in the past, you have to
Yeah,
be
this is
present
from our
and vote no.
You actually have to
You
vote
voted
on.
no, because if you voted yay and signed to the minority report, then there's a conflict. in-
All right.
Point of order. So I
Oh, I'm
think,
sorry, please.
so it's my understanding that if they're adopted policies, those would supersede the Robert's Rules of Orders.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Chris, would you run that to ground?
Yep.
And if you can put Commissioner Hanson back on the minority report, we'd appreciate it. Even if not, we can talk about it some more later.
I don't know. Is it too late for, Derek wants to be on it. It's-
Derek, did you miss that vote too?
No.
I did not miss the vote.
Oh,
I
He just
missed the
get-
opportunity to
Yeah.
sign on to the minority report.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but the window, I mean, it hasn't been submitted right yet, and there's.
Well, I know one thing for sure, like if I'm doing there's a good possibility that I'd be part of a work session, and I would certainly relay to the board that is divisive, and we have at least 3, if not 4 commissioners going the other direction.
in my mind, I think that's the information that needs to be conveyed.
Yeah.
My preference would be.
Like, I have no intention on telling the BOCC anything other than what everybody feels. Yeah.
The recommendation will have the votes on there, in the letter. So the board will see who,
They'll know what
how
to vote.
many voted in favor versus against.
Yeah, but there's that, and then there's the minority report, which is, I mean, you could oppose, you could vote no, but still not agree with the minority report.
Correct.
So it's important. I mean, you could even just write a email, I guess, to the.
Yeah, this also, I mean, that's the other thing too. Everything that we do still goes through a full public process with the BOCC, where as individuals, you're more than welcome to address them against outside of minority reports or planning commission recommendations. Commissioner Wheatley, did you have anything else for the good of the order? Does anybody else have anything for the good of the order?
Just something quick. I know it's tentative, but I'm assuming we're scratching emergency housing off.
The
August
third,
3rd.
yes. It'll be on the August 17th, which means something else will have to be bumped.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, our tentative schedule is more tentative than previously tentative. Does anybody else have anything for the good of the order? Okay, having no further business, this meeting is adjourned.